Okay, we're back. We're live. It's Monday afternoon at 3 o'clock. We're doing community matters, and we have a very interesting discussion, which is close to my heart, with Mark Keim, MD. He's with Disaster DOC LLC, and Karl Kim, our very own from UH Manoa, professor of of urban and regional planning there, here on Community Matters, and we're talking about PRiMO today. I made an irregular title for the show called PRiMO. It's not a beer.
It's not a beer. Well, it is a beer, but in this case, it's not the beer.
So say hello, gentlemen, to our audience. Say whatever you want.
Hi. It's my pleasure to be here.
Okay. So the operative fact is that today, tomorrow, begins this extraordinary conference, this PRiMO conference, which stands for Pacific Risk Management Ohana. The I is assumed. It's a silent I. Well, it's an implied I.
Yeah, right.
The I, it must be implied in all these things. Okay.
It is a vowel.
It is a vowel. How much for a vowel?
Right.
But you're both involved in it. Karl, you're the co-chair of the program. And Mark, you are one of the keynote speakers, speaking on Wednesday.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so, I really am interested. We cover this all the time. And it's nice to have our paths converge a little to discuss it. So I guess I would ask you first, so get the stage, set the stage. Tell me about the conference. How did it come about? What do you hope to achieve? How is it going to unfold starting right now?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is the 13th year of the conference, and PRiMO is comprised of a number of different agencies involved in disaster risk and reduction. It includes NOAA, FEMA, the Army Corps of Engineers, many state and local agencies, university researchers, NGOs, different groups that are involved in all phases of disaster risk reduction and resilience. So every year we get together and do a number of different things. First, we have outstanding speakers that come from all over to present the latest developments in sometimes in detection or warning or alert systems, but also about programs for building awareness and preparedness. The other thing that we do is we have training workshops, and this morning and this afternoon at the convention center, there are workshops on how to use UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, or drones as they're sometimes referred to, for disaster management. We also have a course on food security, another one that's on tsunami modeling, and then we also have some courses on grant writing. And then the other thing that we do, in addition to having the conferences and exchanging information, is that we have working sessions. We have these groups called WHOIs, and we have one on risk assessment, another on a new one that's just formed on health security. We have a great one that's on indigenous knowledge and environment, as well as other kind of more conventional types of committees on information technologies and geospatial technologies. We have a training and education community, WHOI, and then also a communications WHOI. And then in addition to exchanging information, for having these training workshops and these working sessions where we try to pull together plans for preparedness, we also try to honor some individuals, and several people who have made significant contributions in terms of building resilience, building resilient communities, will be honored at this event.
You want to tell us a little about who that might be?
Well, some of it I think it's a surprise, but one of them I can announce, right, because it's, I, in addition to being a professor of urban and regional planning, I direct the National Disaster Preparedness Training Center. It's a FEMA Homeland Security funded center housed at the University of Hawaii. And every year we've awarded someone with the Community Resilience Leadership Award. And this year, I'm very pleased to announce that the recipient of that award will be Dr. John K. Matsuoka, who is president and CEO of the Consuelo Foundation. And we're recognizing him not only for his years of work as a professor and social worker and dean of social work at the University of Hawaii, but for his leadership and working with the Consuelo Foundation following Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, and really the important work that he's been doing, that the foundation has been doing in terms of working with women and children and other impacted groups in the Philippines. And so we will be honoring him as well as others who I think will be announced at the awards ceremony on Wednesday.
Well, thank you for giving us at least his name.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Dr. Keim, you're giving this keynote. You're a medical doctor. You're talking about the relationship of health and, I guess, post-disaster planning, I guess. That's what it is, eh?
Yeah, and in particular for this conference, I'm talking about it in relationship to climate change. And, we expect that climate change is, well, it already is. It's already increasing the number of what we call extreme weather events. So floods, hurricanes, landslides, and so on. And so what we're seeing now is increasing number of health effects from those as well. In addition to those extreme weather events, we can expect increased areas of malnutrition in the Pacific. We can expect changes where diseases normally are in one area for them to move to other areas. And we can also expect some of those diseases that we already know in the developed world, like strokes and heart attacks, for those to increase because of these kinds of changes in our climate. So what I'm really trying to do is to get out ahead of that and start talking about prevention and preparedness for those kinds of changes that we are already seeing in the Pacific, and we can expect for them to go on for quite a few years more.
How many?
How many
years?
How many years? We're talking decades, maybe 100 years.
Why does it end? Why do the effects of climate change end?
I would love to see them end. And and I would propose that we do that right now. If we were to stop burning fossil fuels today, we could still expect over 100 years of change in the climate, and that to continue on, not to end abruptly, but remarkable changes. We're already seeing more drastic changes in the temperature of the globe than what were predicted even 2 decades ago. So what we're really trying to do is to catch up the health component, to really to get up to the point where we are already experiencing it. And I can share with you a few examples of things that I've seen already in the Pacific that are rather remarkable impacts that are directly attributed to that.
Okay, well, hold that for a minute.
Sure.
So I'd like, you guys didn't start you didn't start at PRiMO. You started somewhere else, both of you. Okay, Karl, you started out as I shouldn't say an ordinary planner. You went to school, you took your PhD in planning. I guess that's, regional planning, right. City planning,
that's right.
Making our community better physically, all that Sim City stuff, right? And then something happened to you. A voice spoke to you and said, no, it's dynamic. The world is changing. What was that process, and why did you change this way?
I think so much of it is exactly what Mark Dr. Keim was talking about. The impacts from climate change, from sea level rise, from global environmental change, they are just so much more profound and felt here in Hawaii, in islands. I mean, the islands, the Pacific Islands, are like early warning systems. Everything happens a lot sooner, a lot more intensely, and a lot more apparently than on a large landmass. I think it's both the science, the changing climate, the rising temperatures, the increase in ocean acidification, but it's also the social science, where people are moving, how they're making their livelihoods, closer and closer to the ocean, closer and closer to the hazard zones. And we in Hawaii, we're sort of doubly blessed and cursed at the same time. We, on the one hand, live in this beautiful, spectacular place close to the ocean, but we're also living in a very hazardous, dangerous environment, one with hurricanes and storm surge, and we have earthquakes and tsunamis and volcanoes, and then all the climate-related issues like drought and wildfire, and so we have all of the hazards. And so I think these are really critical issues that I think relate fundamentally back to both the science, but also how we adapt to these sorts of changes in the environment, how we plan and manage our communities, how we ensure that our communities are safe and resilient, and then also able to sustain ourselves here in the middle of the Pacific.
I always say, I told you before, I always say that look up, it's a beautiful day in Hawaii. It's one day closer to climate change, to a really bad storm that wrecks our community. And and here you are, you're the executive director, and I presume also a founder of the National Disaster Preparedness Training Center. They've been on this program, various members and satellite, supporters have been on this program many times. But I wonder, how much this migration has changed your professional life, Karl. It sounds to me like this is really important, so you must be spending a fair amount of time doing it.
I don't know. In some respects, it's old wine in a new bottle. You know what I mean, it's maybe I shouldn't say old.
It's all right. It's all right.
But again, a lot of the basics that we talk about in terms of land use, in terms of environmental management, of being in tune with our community, both in terms of the needs as well as our capabilities. I think that's really what this is about. So I don't really view this as something all that new or really different from.
But to you, it's very important.
Yeah, I think it is important. I think it's and I think it's going to become increasingly important as we look at the increasing cost of disasters, the increasing frequency of disasters, and the intensity of them as well too.
Isn't it possible, Karl, that we can escape completely? I mean, the storm would just sort of pass us by, sort of through a divine process, and we wouldn't have any problem at all. And a few hours later, we'd look and we'd see the rainbow.
Right. And then it's just a natural event, right? It isn't a disaster.
Yeah.
It becomes a disaster when people are killed or injured or lose their homes or their businesses and their livelihoods are disrupted. And so that's what we have to pay attention to.
Oh, can't we wish for the better option? Can't we, pray a little?
Yeah, well, yeah. I think that's always good. I mean, I guess the expression is, plan for the worst and
Wish for the
pray
best.
for the best, right? right. So,
Mark, you graduated medical school. You're a doctor, and I've been having this pain right here.
Yeah.
Anyway.
What's your insurance?
there you go.
That's right. That's what always happens, doesn't it? So at some point you decided that you really got interested in this instead.
Yeah.
What was the change in thinking for you?
I became interested in disasters at 3:16 p.m. on May 29th in 1982. And the reason being is that my home was hit by a tornado, and I lost all material possessions and almost lost my life. But the interesting thing
Your
about
home in
that,
Alabama.
Actually, it was Illinois at the time.
Okay.
Yeah, and it was an F4 tornado. They categorized from 1 to 5, 5 being the most severe. And what I learned at that time was actually I was about 21, 22 in pre-med, trying to get into medical school, studying at the college. And 15 years prior, I'm dating myself because I had.
We're all making mathematical calculations on your age.
Yeah, that's right. It's easy to look up here and
Put
see
that
my
pen
age
down.
there. So my mom, actually, I had talked my mom into buying me a book from a little publication we had called The Weekly Reader that we received every week at school. And the book was actually about tornadoes. And in that 30 or 40 pages, I learned about how tornadoes move and how they act and how you protect yourself at the level of what a 7-year-old could be able to read. And then actually 15 years later, when the tornado came down my street, I used the things that I had learned to actually save my life. And making not only the first decision, but I made another decision that if I'd stayed with the first decision, my wife and I wouldn't be here today. And it was that little book of a 7-year-old, simple book, children's book, that saved a 7-year-old read that saved my life later. So that was when I realized.
How did that work?
You mean the event itself?
Yeah. Well, how did it save your life?
And it actually told me how to take cover, how to protect myself when I saw the tornado. It was on the distance, and we had heard the sirens. And then I went outside and was trying to find my neighbors because I knew I needed to be in a basement. And when I saw it hitting a schoolhouse, a 3-story schoolhouse, it destroyed the schoolhouse, and I knew that I really needed to be protected. And so that's when I made another decision to get out of the tornado's way. And my home was actually completely destroyed. We would have been killed inside that home.
Hold that thought. We're going to take a short break. That's Mark Keim, MD, Disaster DOC, LLC, and Karl Kim, UH Manoa Professor of Urban and Regional Planning. We're talking about PRiMO, which is Pacific Risk Management Ohana. We'll be right back.
Aloha, I'm Hunter Hevlin, host of Sustainable Hawaii here at ThinkTech Hawaii. You can tune in every week on Thursday at 2 p.m. to see interviews with sustainability professionals from around the state and even further abroad, learning about activities with water management, food security, waste management, and a whole host of other fascinating opportunities to get engaged with making a greener island. So if you're interested in making the transition from consuming individuals to communities of producers, check us out every Thursday.
Aloha, my name is Paul Jackson, better known as PJ, and my local interest is in sports. I have my own sports radio show at KWAI AM 1080 that you can stream live. I also have my own website, pjsportsradio.com. We have live guests in studio, and we talk about discussions and topics that everyone wants to know locally here on the islands. We cover everything from surfing to basketball to whatever's going on locally, sports-wise. We try to do our best and cover the topics in depth as much as we can. Once again, thank you for joining PJ here on Hawaii Sports Update. Mahalo.
Okay, we're back. We're live with Mark Keim and Karl Kim. There is a relation. You guys related?
Karl Keim.
No, Karl Keim and Mark
That's
Kim.
right?
Two brothers from another mother.
Spiritual. Okay, so you just came back from Sendai, Japan. You happened to be at a conference there together. This was about also disaster risk reduction. Can you tell me about the conference and what was discussed there?
Well, it was the third United Nations World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction. And it was a very, very important meeting. Over 5,000 people gathered in Sendai. And, you know, this is in Tohoku, or in the region that was most heavily damaged by the tsunami.
It makes it especially
2011.
poignant.
Yes, yes. And so, and also, it is the 10th year of the UN Hyogo Framework for Action, which it was an opportunity to look back over the last 10 years in terms of the progress that's been made in terms of reducing the harm from disasters, but then also to look forward into the future, the next 10, 15 years, and identify some key priorities and directions that the world as a whole needs to move towards in order to reduce the risks and so forth. So this was an enormously important meeting. Well, because of the huge number of people that have been killed. Depending on whether you look at the last 12 years or the last 10 years, 700,000 or 1.2 million people have been killed. 1.7
natural disasters.
Of natural disasters. 1.7 million people have been displaced or had their lives affected. The losses have been just trillions and trillions of dollars, and those are the losses that we can tabulate. There are so many other losses that we've not done a good job in terms of tabulating. I mean, the secondary impacts, the impacts on infectious disease or those with chronic disease or substance abuse. We don't really have good metrics in terms of capturing all of those numbers worldwide. So I think there's still a lot more work that needs to be done. But before we get too much further, something you may not be aware, he won a really impressive award there. And maybe you should ask him about the award.
First, I'll ask you, and then we'll. What was the award?
It was an award for leaders in. You have to tell us what the award is.
It was called the Sasakawa Award.
Okay.
And it's put together by a foundation that recognizes world leaders in disaster risk reduction. And there were 3 separate awards, sort of gold, silver, and bronze. And I won the bronze, so to speak. I shared that with another.
But you still medaled, right? So.
Yes, not like the Olympics already. So why were you given the award? What have you done, okay, to justify that award?
Well, their justification is making a difference across different sectors. So as being a doctor, not just focusing on medical care, but also focusing on business. I went back and got an MBA to better understand the economics of disaster risk reduction. I also brought together other sectors of volunteerism in the United States and also trying to impress upon our government and other governments around the world the importance of disaster reduction and how this is multi-sectoral. It takes different groups of people to save people's lives. If you build a building in a dangerous area, it's not the health department or the doctors that solve that problem. It's people like Karl and folks that talk about sustainable development and safe environments. And so it was for those kinds of
I
reasons.
get two things. Congratulations
Thank
on
you,
the
sir.
award. It was only a few days ago. Eh?
Yeah.
I get two things out of this. One is I get the fact that a lot of people have died in recent years, and you can attribute a fair number of those to climate change already. The second thing, and that's really the worst kind of medical problem, to die. It's more serious than just injury or infection, although it could be less painful depending on what happens. Anyway, the other thing is, and I think it's really important from your point of view. I mean, you have seized on this, and it sounds to me like Karl, you have sort of changed your professional life completely to deal with this issue. Is that that when infrastructure is destroyed by climate change, the human world changes. You can't support as many people in a given society if the infrastructure is all taken away from you suddenly, and they get sick, they die. Our world, if not already, then soon enough is being transformed by climate change, and it's not going to end right away. It may get worse and worse for a while. And you're going to be out there trying to save lives. That's what you're doing. I would give you an award, too.
Well, thank you, sir. Thank you. I think for me, I started out as an emergency physician. So I was always seeing the person after they got sick and after they got injured and trying to save their lives then. And that's pretty meaningful, and you can see the response for that. But when I started studying disasters, I did a 2-year fellowship specifically looking at disaster medicine in particular. And what I found is the majority of people actually die during the impact of the disaster. In other words, when the wind is still blowing, when the buildings are still shaking, and there are no ambulances on the streets, there's no federal government coming to help you. So if 90% of people die then when we respond, we're responding too late for the health sector. We can come in and rebuild buildings and bridges and electrical systems and so on, but we can't replace those deaths. And that's when I started getting interested in preventing. How can we keep people safe before it happens?
Yeah.
And that's really been my life focus.
And how can you save them from a slow death after it happens? Because the world won't be able to support them in the same way, and they'll have to be much more self-reliant than they were before. But this takes me to your thing, Karl, and that is you recognize, you both do, that we have to reorder our society to survive in a declining climate. We have to change everything. It's not only building buildings that will protect people, it's reordering our cities. All the regional planning that you learned comes into play, except you now have to modify it to make it safer.
Yeah, at the meetings in Sendai, there was another statistic that I heard released, and it said 87% of the losses, the fatalities, the losses that occurred related to disasters can be attributed to climate issues, to drought, to flooding, to typhoons, strong storms. And so there is this really big, important connection between climate change, and disasters and disaster risk reduction. And so it does require for us to think differently, to think about the ways in which we can adapt our buildings so that they're sturdier, that they're better able to withstand changes in the environment, to build better systems of communication so that people can get information about approaching storms, so they won't have to rely on these. They will have this information, and they'll know what to do to evacuate, where to go, where the safe locations are, how they can protect
food
themselves.
systems.
Water and food systems.
Health systems.
And very, very quickly, when you start looking at this, it gets really complicated and all-engrossing very, very quickly. So I agree with you, but part of it is sort of changing awareness and increasing this kind of psychology of...
We're going to go to that, but I want to ask you one question that comes to mind from this discussion, is that if you withdraw the indicia of civilization, the indicia of a community, the infrastructure by which people live together, then what you find is a social collapse too. I mean, would it surprise you very much if somebody wanted your food and who was going to knock on your door until you gave them the food or break your door down for that food, and then you have a decline of the social compact. Would it surprise you if one country decided it didn't have enough water, could change in the water table, and so it went to another country and took the water by force or food? And I guess you have to think about that too. Do your conferences in Sendai and here, do they address those questions?
Well, Jay, I'd like to respond to that. I think, you're talking about those two different things of countries fighting over water. That's one issue. And then the other is, will your neighbor take your food? And what we find actually in human behavior in disasters is people actually become very much more altruistic. Disasters bring out the best in people. And actually the things that you hear about looting and other kinds of social disruption are very rare and usually associated with conflict, not natural disasters. People give in disasters.
Knock wood.
Yeah, knock wood, exactly.
We're still learning.
Yeah, that's right. But people are more apt to say, look, I have this last bowl of rice, you take it for your children instead of me, and so on. But now this other issue of water, now that's a different story, and we're already seeing the potential for conflict around the world as borderline states, as states that are sharing a border, compete for the resources of water. And I have a boss from years ago, and 20 years ago at CDC, that said, told me one time, the wars now we're fighting over oil, and the wars in the future are fighting over water. Now, I don't have the data for that, but what we're seeing is we are seeing conflict in many areas of the world related to who owns the water. And as it dwindles, I think even Mark Twain had a saying about that years ago for Western water in Western United States. He said, whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting. And so we may see more of that. But I think that certainly is a concern.
Karl?
Yeah, it's really interesting. One of the things that our center has realized is the importance of social capital. I think all of us know about economic capital and natural capital, environmental capital, but we really don't think that much about social capital. And so we're actually developing a course on social capital, what it means, how do you build it.
What does it mean?
What does it mean? Well, it's the relationships between members of a community. And sometimes it's expressed in terms of the bonds that you have, or the linking or bridging that you have, the sharing of resources, but also more than that, it involves the norms, these notions of reciprocity, and how are those built before, during, and after a disaster occurs. And especially in a place like Hawaii, which is so isolated and which we really do need to rely upon each other. We think that there are probably very important lessons, both from our indigenous culture, as well as from others who understand this notion.
Let's talk about that. I think that's really important. Just as Sendai was symbolic to disasters, so was, as you mentioned, is Hawaii important because we are isolated. And see if you disagree with me, but over the years we have become less self-reliant than more self-reliant. That's probably because it's been easy for us. We can ship things in and fly things in, and it all works really swell until a disaster. Then, you say, well, where's the cavalry? And there is no cavalry, and we have to rely on ourselves. Sort of like the ethic in Australia, hundreds of years ago, when they learned as a community to be self-reliant. So how do we get, it's very symbolic that you're having this PRiMO conference here. How do we get from where we are now, which is dependent on bloody everything, to a place where we are self-reliant and soon, so that we can deal with disasters? It's not an easy question.
Yeah, it was interesting. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, he opened the meetings in Sendai by saying the road to sustainability starts in Sendai, right? And it's really making these important connections, not just between climate and disaster risk reduction, but also the development goals that we're talking about. And for us to become a more sustainable community, whether in Hawaii or whether, as a world system, we really do need to focus on these issues now. And so I think a lot of the training courses that we're trying to develop look at issues like food security and self-sufficiency, and how can we survive off the grid if something, when we almost had a shipping strike several weeks ago, how would we organize ourselves to share under those sorts of hardships? And I think that that's an important part of what we need to work on at individual communities, but also globally.
We're going to take a short break again. When we come back, I'd like to talk about how you translate the training, the recognition of the problem, the training, the scope of what we need to do into actual action using our existing governmental apparatus in order to organize people to actually take the steps you guys are recommending. It's not easy here or anywhere else. Okay, that's Mark Keim, MD, Disaster Doc, right, LLC. He's also an international consultant on these issues. Karl Kim, Manoa, professor of let's see, I can't read it. Oh, urban and regional planning for many, many years, well known for that. Okay, we're here on Community Matters. We're talking about PRiMO. It's not a beer. It's Pacific Risk Management Ohana.
It can be a beer.
It can be a beer. Beer is good when you need it. And the conference is going on now. We'll continue through the week. We'll be right back to discuss more.
Inspired by an ancient culture, classical Chinese dance, vigorous physicality, timeless stories, 5,000 years of Chinese music and dance, Shen Yun presents authentic Chinese culture. Coming to Blaisdell Concert Hall, May 8th and 9th. Tickets at shenyun.com or call 808-792-3919.
Hi, I'm your host on ThinkTech Asia, Bill Sharp. I look forward to you joining us each Monday between 4 and 5 o'clock when we film right here in our studio in downtown Honolulu. The show, ThinkTech Asia, focuses on contemporary events in Asia. And by Asia, we mean anything from Hawaii, south to Australia and New Zealand, west to Pakistan, and as far north as the Russian Far East. Clearly, this is one of the most economically dynamic centers of the world, and we bring you up to date on what's going on in a whole host of countries in this very vital region. We look forward to seeing you. Aloha.
Okay, we're here. We're here with Mark Keim, MD, of Disaster Doc LLC, and Karl Kim at Manoa, and he's also the executive. He's an urban and regional planner, but also he's the executive director of the National Disaster Preparedness Training Center, which we have seen. We've had a number of shows and discussions about that here in ThinkTech. Anyway, so I want to get to the point about you guys are having this conference. You're having training. You're bringing experts in from really everywhere, and you're an example of that, Mark. But how do we get this on the ground? How do we change the way our community works? Just Hawaii, for example. How do we get people, government, academia, industry, everyone to protect, defend, reorganize themselves for this new world? How is the conference going to make that happen?
Well, certainly it's going to raise people's awareness, and that's one of the first steps. And I think also, too, given the level of empowerment that education and training and awareness provides to the individual, you can't underestimate that. A good example was a group called the Medical Reserve Corps, which is developed in the United States to be able to help assist volunteers that show up for every disaster in the United States. And the idea, the government said, look, we need a way to be able to organize these folks because so many people come out of the woodwork in disasters and want to help. And so they put together a skeleton staff of this group, in particular, about 10 people in Washington, and said, okay, let's open up the doors and see how many people come. Today, there are 200,000 volunteers in 2,000 units around the United States, none of them paid except for that 10-person staff. And we started working with those folks, training them how to deploy, because they were going to go to different disasters. And what we found is, of course, over the years, there weren't that many disasters, not everyone deployed. So what they started doing was working in their own neighborhoods to reduce disaster risk. making people healthier, reducing their exposures, the kinds of things that Karl's been pointing out, and working multi-sector, not just doctors and nurses, but groups. So we saw that given the empowerment of the individual and the community, that kind of thing became organic. People necessarily wanted to reduce their risk. So the first thing is just understanding that, what risk is and how you can prevent it. Some people, when I talk about preventing disasters, they say, how can you prevent a hurricane? We may not be able to prevent the hurricane, but we can prevent people from drowning in the hurricane by evacuating them and giving them good shelter, building buildings that withstand these kinds of hazards. So those are the kinds of things I think that really do empower people on a local, and as Karl mentioned, at a community level. The power of the individual can't be underestimated.
What about money? Do we need money to make these dreams come true?
It's remarkable how cost-effective disaster reduction is. And there have been some different studies, for example, in the United States, looking at disaster risk reduction. $1 spent in disaster risk reduction is estimated to save $4 to $7 in response and recovery. And that's if you can recover.
Something about a step in time.
There you are, stitch in time, right? On an international level, it's actually even more effective. World Bank has done some studies looking at $1 spent actually saves $20 in response and recovery. But the other aspect is it's more humane. I like to say, give people the example, which would you rather have, the absolute best surgeon in the world or seatbelts?
That's a great one.
And so it's that idea of prevention.
That's great. Karl, you had some thoughts on
Yeah,
this?
it's interesting. I think when you think about how do you motivate people or increase awareness, get them to act, that's a really tough question. And one approach is you try to scare them, right? If you don't do this, you will lose things. You'll suffer the horrible fate, right? Another way I think is to appeal to their sense of knowledge, to appeal to their sense of the future, to their children, to the assets that they cherish, and it's family, it's neighborhood, it's the things that we view as very important. And then the challenge becomes is how do we motivate and translate this into some type of collective action? It's one thing if you're prepared and he's prepared, but I'm not, right? How do we do this collectively? And that's where I think we can do a lot more. And right now we're sort of divided here. On the one hand, we tend to regulate things in terms of building codes and land use, and so that represents sort of one approach, regulation. Another approach which we're trying to instill is good design. That there will be a return on the investment if you design things to be safe, sustainable.
Safety belt.
Safety belt. Yeah, that's a good design. But this notion of collectively managing risks is an area of our research and my personal interest. How do we do that? And how do we look at not just the threat from tsunamis and hurricanes and storm surge, but also from other types of hazards that affect the same community? And how do we collectively manage these different hazards and risks?
There's a city council right out there, and the state legislature is actually in the same room with them. Governor's there, and all the department heads are there. What's your advice?
First is we have to get the data right. I mean, I believe we need to invest more in mapping the locations of hazards and sharing this information collectively. And right now, we're just not investing enough on the data so that we have a good basis for decision making. The second thing that I think we have to do is to bring together multi-party stakeholders across different, we need not just scientists and engineers and politicians and community leaders, but people from the community so that they can decide together how to manage this risk. And a lot of it oftentimes comes down to what decisions we're going to make in terms of development and infrastructure and where we're going to spend our money and where we're going to build and what we're going to build.
Very nearly everything.
Right. But I mean, you look at the billions of dollars that we are spending in Kaka'ako, right? we need to focus in that area, for example, on risk reduction. It's new development, it's new hazards that are new hazards and threats
Changing
that we have to-
codes.
changing codes,
Zoning.
and planning and land use and environmental
So
decision
who's
making.
telling them you have the chance,
Well,
so this is your
Out
opportunity.
there, I'm telling you,
Okay.
we need to focus on risk and collective risk management. And I think it involves not, actually one of the most interesting panels we're bringing together is all about resilience, and it's going to involve not just federal agencies and the regulatory agencies, but also some people from the insurance industries as well too. Like the reinsurance folks, the insurance, the people who do catastrophic insurance or insurance or insuring the insurance companies, they're really attuned to this. And so the first part of it is getting a firm understanding of really what the risks are. And then the other part of this involves really this collective risk management. And why is it that we don't have enough adequate flood insurance?
This is having a double effect on our economy, though. Some of those things you described cost money.
Right.
If not the government, then the compliance with the government, changes, codes and, zoning, whatnot. So we have to spend more money on that. At the same time, and maybe it's gradual, but soon enough, we're going to lose our beaches. We're probably going to lose some tourism unless we watch out. And our economy will suffer by way of climate change. The threat of a storm, a past storm, it'll empty the beaches, and we won't have our regular tourism cash flow. So how do we deal with that? I mean, it's a societal issue. Certainly, it's relevant to Hawaii.
Can I address that, Jake?
Sure.
I want to point out that, the disaster risk management, the model we're discussing right now, started out as risk management and didn't involve health. It didn't involve disasters. It was actually a financial model that moved to economics and moved to other sectors, engineering and so on, and agriculture. And it's been used by multinational corporations for many years and used effectively to minimize losses and minimize enterprise losses as well. So when we look at, the cost effectiveness of building a building once and then suffering its losses and the loss of business and so on, as opposed to building it once and having it be sustainable, it's really a cost-effective means. And so we on the health side want to look at the health costs or look at the human costs. But it just makes good sense, and I've actually met with the American Association of Reinsurance and as well as some of the representatives from Munich Re and Swiss Re, which are the reinsurance groups, and they say that we're on a non-sustainable course, that in the future, insurance will be no longer affordable and a good business model for anyone, because when the losses, risk pooling is we all put our money in, and we basically take the risk that it's not going to happen to us. So if my house burns down, you and Karl pay for my home to be rebuilt, and that's the insurance model. But what if all of our houses burn down simultaneously? Now there's not enough money in the pool. So the idea that we can sustain this over time without worrying about the long-term losses is just simply untenable. And if you look at the major corporations in the emerging markets right now, they've accepted this fact and are working towards that. And I can give you one brief example. I was recently in Vietnam in March, and Vietnam has annual floods in central Vietnam. Every year, 5 million people out of their homes. Hitachi recognizes that the Vietnamese population has a great market for labor. And so they want their factories there to be able to utilize the labor, but there's also floods. So Hitachi, working with the government of Vietnam, monitors the rainfall in the mountains where it begins, tracks the level of the rivers all the way down, and then provides a warning system for the population, maps the hazards like what Karl is talking about, and make sure that not only their companies and their factories are not in the floodplain, but their people are not in the floodplain.
Yeah, important. It's an important concept. By the way, 60 Minutes, I don't know if you guys were flying at the time this was playing, but 60 Minutes had an interesting program that shows you we're already in trouble on the insurance, reinsurance, over the storm in New York, where it found a lot of fraud on the part of the insurance companies for denying claims that should have been granted. And that is going to come up. But I'd like to leave one question, I'd like to give one opportunity for an answer on one question. What state of mind should we have? Because we all know that there'll be a storm here, that there'll be implications. How should we see that? Should we be afraid? Should we be confident? How do we deal with it?
Well, one of the other things
Yeah,
that
1
actually
minute, Karl.
that came out of the meetings in Sendai, which I really like, was a big emphasis on recovery. We've been talking about preparedness and to some extent response, but really what we also need to focus on is how do you recover, and we don't know exactly what it will be, whether it's a typhoon or a hurricane or a tsunami. How do you recover from that? And I think we need to invest resources and time and energy into thinking about how do you come back, how do you build back better after some type of catastrophic event.
And then we can feel confident that whatever happens, we can return.
A little bit more confident.
Yeah, a little bit more confident. Mark Keim, MD with DisasterDoc.LLC, or LLC, yeah, DisasterDoc LLC. And Karl Keim, UH Manoa Professor of Urban and Regional Planning and the Executive Director of the National Disaster Preparedness Training Center. Both of them are deeply involved in PRiMO, which is the Pacific Risk Management Ohana, which is happening right now today in Waikiki and through the week. And what's the hotel?
It's at the Hawaii Convention Center.
At the Convention Center, okay? If you get a chance, go down. Thanks very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Aloha.